Welcome to this Mansfield First Take, a community education program providing rapid response efforts to educate the public on current events that affect our country. I'm Anna Alonso. I'm a student program coordinator here at the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center. This afternoon's First Take features Mansfield Center's Regional Studies professor, Professor Owen discussing Lithuania and Russia, spotlighting important historical and geopolitical themes in Russia-Lithuanian relations. The nonpartisan Mansfield Center advances ethical leadership, civic responsibility, and international understanding, values that are essential to strengthening American democracy, leadership, and national security. Rooted in the legacy of Mike and Maureen Mansfield, our dialogues work to foster civic exchanges of ideas from diverse viewpoints, reinforce the importance of democratic institutions, and examine the role that ethical values play in public life. Our speaker will take questions from the audience following his presentations, so please post your questions in the Q&A box. I'm honored today to introduce our speaker, Owen Surs. Owen Surs is an adjunct professor at the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center, where he teaches international security to members of the U.S. military. He is the author of several books, the most recent of which is Iran's Quds Force, Proxy Wars, Terrorism, and the War on America. Welcome, Professor Surs.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and good afternoon to everybody out there. Greetings from, kind of a grayish Missoula day. I think we were spoiled by the very nice weather we had earlier in the week. But what we're going to talk about today is another gray country at this time of year, namely Lithuania. So I'm going to proceed down to the next slide. Just to clarify a few things in advance, in case you're wondering, who the heck goes to a cold, gray country in February and lives in Missoula? After all, most would prefer Hawaii or Cabo or Cancun. That seems to make a lot of sense, right? Well, I'm that kind of knucklehead that goes to a cold, gray country and lives in Missoula in February. And by the way, it was cold. By the way, it was 3 degrees Fahrenheit. I had to convert the minus 18 centigrade and figure out what the heck that was all about, and realized that what I was feeling was cold was in fact very cold. And of course, everybody says, well, there's a difference, between a dry cold and a wet cold. And, I kind of poo-pooed that. I've lived here in Montana now for 19 years, and I thought, yeah, they're just exaggerating. But actually, there is a difference. It was cold. And, oh, by the way, unlike here, there was lots of snow there. And unlike here, it snowed practically the whole time I was there. I caught the flu about halfway through my trip. Yay. And so enough said about some of the personal traumas and travails of being 3 planes away from home and down with the flu in a Marriott hotel. So you might ask, why Lithuania? Why February? Just a little bit about myself, and I promise I'll leave most of me out of this. But my university year abroad many, many, many years ago was in Poland, 1990 to 1991. I wasn't there for the end of communism, but I was there for the transition in Poland away from communism to democracy. And by the way, other colleagues of mine in university were going to Paris and Lyon and Marseille and Rome. And no, I was going to Warsaw. But you know what? Thump your chest, right? It's Warsaw. It's January. It's cold and gray. Why not? And I think one of the biggest takeaways I had from my time in Poland was knowing something about a country which before the trip I knew nothing, right? So we had classes in Polish history, Polish literature, and I got quickly kind of hooked into it. I mean, it's not the most uplifting of histories. If you know anything about Polish history, it's kind of depressing. But there was always a Lithuania angle to it. Didn't matter, right? Even in the literature, the most famous Polish classical poet was someone named Adam Mickiewicz. And of course, you hear about Mickiewicz and how he's the founder, kind of like the Pushkin, the Russian Pushkin. It's the Polish Mickiewicz. But there was always a Lithuanian angle. Um, and in fact, in a lot of ways, Poland and Lithuania are glued at the hip. But just don't tell the Lithuanians this, because they've spent much of the 20th century trying to shove that Polish angle into a tight little box and pretend it isn't there. They're the smaller country of the two, so it's kind of like being the little brother trying to get out from the big brother's shadow. The problem then was I couldn't visit Lithuania. I wanted to. It was 1990, though, and it was still part of the USSR. And to cross the border, one needed visas and other things. All right, so enough of me. Let's go into a little of the basic facts about Lithuania. Uh, Thanks for that, right? Eastern Europe, but hey, why don't we situate ourselves? A land area that is significantly smaller than that of Montana. You could squeeze several Lithuanias into Montana with room to spare. With a shoreline on the Baltic Sea, that's where I think a lot of the cold, frigid, wet temperatures came from. And it borders four countries. It borders Belarus, it borders Latvia, it borders Russia. Uh, Kind of a strange little thing there. It's a piece of Russia that is separate from the rest of Russia. And then it borders, of course, Poland, but actually a very, very small border with Poland, but one that is very significant. When we look at Lithuania in terms of population, it's a little under 3 million. So it's a small country. But in Montana terms, it's kind of densely packed. I mean, we have a little over 1 million people in this state, and yet, as you saw in the previous slide, we've got a significantly greater land area. So Lithuania is small population-wise, but it's tightly packed population as well. The fertility rate, I know some people laugh and say, how can you have 1.3 babies per woman, right? But it's a statistic, right? And according to demographers, to replace a population, you need about 2.1 per woman. So you see here how Lithuania is far from replenishing its own population. In fact, it ranks, according to a UN survey, 185 out of 209 political units around the world, so including Hong Kong and Macau and places that aren't technically countries. But you don't want to be 185 on that list. It means that you're going to get smaller in population as time goes on. The median age in Lithuania is about 44 years, which is a little bit older than the United States. I think we're 39 or thereabouts. But 44 is getting up there, right? Hey, I'm 56. I can say that safely. And the urbanization is about 70%, which actually is not too surprising for Lithuania because of the three Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, it has always been the most rural, with a significant contribution to its economy made by agriculture. The native languages. So here I made a deliberate choice. Sometimes people like to say, so what's the ethnicities of these countries? And I don't know if really that's the best way of looking at it. I prefer to look at it this way. What's the native language of the population? And according to Lithuanian statistics, 85% speak Lithuanian as their mother tongue. So their first language is Lithuanian. And then you see here Russian is about 7% and Polish is 5%. So unlike Latvia, where there's a significantly greater Russian speaking population, Lithuania is a pretty dominant in terms of Lithuanian being the language. But there's a demographic challenge, as I mentioned. Lithuania is shrinking. It has been shrinking for some time. You see on this graph on the right-hand side that Lithuania has been in a long, slow decline in terms of its overall population. The estimated population of Lithuania in 2050 will be 2.2 million, so that's down, from 2.8 today. Uh, That's a shrinking population, and it's a population that's only getting older. If you want to extend it even as far out as 2100, God help us what kind of world we're going to live in then. I don't think I'm going to be around. But we're looking at 1.5 to 1.7 million. So is this really unusual? Might be your next question. A smaller aging population. Not really. All of its neighbors, Russia, Belarus, to a lesser extent Poland, but certainly Latvia and Estonia, they're all getting smaller and they are all getting older. This seems to be a general trend that's becoming a worldwide, except in Africa. So Asia, for example, especially East Asia, is getting older, and over time, its population is going to get smaller. For Lithuania, though, this could be an existential problem. Existential is the kind of verb that you see sometimes with small countries, right? They're small and they fear disappearing altogether. 1.5 million people is going to be a pretty small group by global standards in 2100, if that in fact is what Lithuania's future shall prove to be. Um, some people call this a small nation complex. And when you go there and you see some of the historical exhibits there, it's easy to see why they have this. It's hard for us as Americans to grasp. One, because we live in a country of immigrants. We live in a country that is constantly being replenished by new arrivals. And so we have a kind of a different view on history and a different view on our own country for the most part. Um, but it is characteristic of all three Baltic states. And so here Lithuania shares a lot with its neighbors. Their combined population, by the way, right now is about 6 million people, all three combined. That's next to nothing. That's small. I mean, that's the inner urban area maybe of Chicago. And here we're talking about three separate countries. And remember something. I mean, this is the only home for these peoples. For Estonians, for Latvians, Lithuanians, it is in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There's this tie to the land. However far back, I'll leave it for archaeologists and historians to decide. But I mean, this is it for them, right? This is their place on earth. As Americans, we tend to be, well, I mean, I moved here from Virginia, and before that, I moved from Canada. So I've kind of moved around a lot in my lifetime. That has been historically less so for peoples in this part of the world. Could Lithuania or Lithuanians one day just fade out? And this is not being, hyperbolic about this. I mean, my God, there won't be any left. It is a reality, if only in demographic terms. We haven't added the historical piece yet. We see how the population is getting smaller and getting older. This is a point where demographers are beginning to wonder what the world will look like 200 years from now when all other things being equal, and those are a lot of other things, the world will be quite a bit different than it is today in terms of age and population size. So I have to give you a little dose of history. I know Americans in general are not supposed to have much of a tolerance for history except our own, but this is the way you understand at least the Lithuanian point of view in all this. By the way, they were once a superpower, and everybody's snickering, right? A superpower? I've never heard of Lithuania as a superpower. Well, this was for the most part before the United States existed as a country, so that's how far back we have to go. But yes, it was in the 16th and 17th centuries. Everybody has their golden age, right? Just depends on how far back you want to go. There was something called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the impossible Polish pronunciation of Rzeczpospolita. I think I got that right. Um, you see on the map on the right-hand side how this mass state, it was a big state at one time, but in the course of a very short period of time, went to nothing. It vanished, right? You probably heard of the partitions of Poland, the four partitions of Poland. Well, by the end of the 18th century, Poland ceased to exist. It wasn't there anymore. It had been divided up. Um, and so this Commonwealth collapsed partly because of its own weaknesses. So, just a little diversion here. There was at one point such a screwed up Polish parliament that the only way you could make a law pass was, they called it liberum veto, was everybody had to say yay. If you had a single dissenting voice, then the bill wouldn't pass. Can you imagine how you could run a government that way? And then imagine how outsiders like Austria, Prussia, Russia, all they had to do was pay off one parliamentarian, right? One noble, I should say. And you could screw up Poland forever, which is exactly what happened. And so, piece by piece, Austria, Prussia, which would later become Germany, divided up Poland between them, and of course, with it, Lithuania. So, Lithuania fell under the Russian Empire. And even in Vilnius, the capital today, you can see a number of Russian Orthodox churches. In the 19th century, like a lot of countries in this part of the world, there was an awakening among the Lithuanian peasantry. It was partly the spread of literacy. It was partly a movement in neighboring Germany, the German Romantic movement. But there was this idea that we as Lithuanian peasants have something in common. We have a national bond between us. It's our language, it may be our faith. Most are Roman Catholic. It has to do with things like fairy tales, dancing, common dances that we have, village cultures. All of this starts to form and mass together as a national consciousness, which they previously didn't have. And then all you needed was a couple of pointy-headed intelligentsia types, intellectuals, to frame a Lithuanian national consciousness. So this flag that you see here in the background, the yellow, green, and red, is the Lithuanian national colors. The flag was formed at the end of the 19th century by a famous Lithuanian painter. I think another key to the Lithuanian identity, unlike Latvia and Estonia, was the Catholic Church. Remember, I said Lithuania and Poland are kind of tied at the hip, whether they like it or not. The Catholic Church is another thing that bonds them together. 1918, end of World War I, collapse of Russian Empire, Russian Revolution. There's an independent Lithuanian Republic. It's not exactly a happy one, partly because its capital was a city called Kaunas, not Vilnius. As events were to show after World War I, Vilnius fell under Polish control, where they called it Vilno. And of course, this became part of endless animosity between Lithuanians and Poles that lasted well into this century. They stole our capital, but it was always a Polish city. No, it wasn't. It was partly a Jewish city. You can see how these arguments can just go on and never really end anywhere. All right, then the famous Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939. Poland gets invaded, occupied, divided, disappears from the map a fourth time. This is the fourth partition. The Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all get absorbed into the USSR, including Finland. But Finland decided to say no to Stalin, and they fought a 10-month war, which was the Finno-Russian War. The Soviets subjugated Lithuania. From the Lithuanian point of view, if you go there, they have a number of museums. I think the best one to go to, I think it's called the Museum of Subjugated Peoples and Genocide. It changes its name, but it talks about how in 1940 they were given an ultimatum, Hitler style, by the Soviets. And basically, a little country like this is not going to be able to stand up to the Red Army. And then came the mass deportations. This is a part of their history we don't know so well, but almost as soon as the Soviets parked themselves in Lithuania, they began to deport so-called kulaks, or so-called rich peasants, among others, and sent them out to Siberia. And among them were, of course, Lithuanians, but there were a lot of Jews living in Lithuania at the time. This is before the Holocaust. And there were a lot of Poles. A lot of them got shipped out to Siberia, and a lot of them died out there because of the weather. I thought it was cold in Vilnius. I cannot imagine what minus 40 degrees centigrade is. I can't conceive it. But a lot of people were sent out there and lived for many years out there before they were allowed to return in the 1950s and 60s. This marks the Lithuanian consciousness, so keep it in mind. Then, 41 to 44, they were under Nazi occupation. And, as we know, the Holocaust wiped out pretty much all Lithuanian Jews. A little known piece of the history is that Vilnius, Vilna, depending on what you want to call it, was a city that was about a third Jewish at one time, was the center of Jewish rabbinical theology, as well as a major center of Yiddish publications. And all of this gets wiped out. There are very, very few signs left that there was ever a Jewish presence in Vilnius today. The Holocaust Museum there, frankly, is a joke. I'm saying that respectfully because it's a four-room cottage, and that's the memorial to hundreds of thousands of people who were wiped out by the Nazis. Okay, reoccupation and resistance. The Red Army comes back in 1944, and with it came Stalin's infamous secret police, the NKVD. Lithuania was supposedly liberated, although, as they say, we've been liberated lots of times and never really liberated. And then the deportations to Siberia resumed, as if the first time wasn't enough. Now all the so-called Nazi collaborators were loaded onto trains and shipped out to Siberia and chucked onto these kolkhozes, literally communal farms, and said, "Hey, you go to work now," despite the weather and living conditions. This gave rise to the Forest Brothers in Lithuania. These were anti-Soviet partisans. Now, Russians will call them fascists. A lot of Russians will. To Lithuanians, they're national heroes. Here's a dialogue that will never meet. A lot were frankly men and women with no choice. They were being hunted by the secret police. Um, Whether they were collaborators with the Nazis or not is kind of a moot point at this juncture, because a lot of them, when they were finally located and discovered by the NKVD, were shot. A few survived. In fact, there's a famous story in Latvia of one guy basically living out in the woods from 1945 to 1989. How's that, right? It's kind of like those stories of the Japanese soldier who never surrendered in the Philippines until he finally came out of the bush in the 70s. Look, we have a role in this too. There were promises being dangled by the CIA and British MI6 of aid for the Forest Brothers in all three Baltic countries. Unfortunately, for them and us, Kim Philby, if you've never heard of him, the famous Soviet spy and British intelligence, betrayed all of these efforts. So these guys would get dropped out of the sky on parachute or landed by ship, and they were shot practically as soon as they landed on Lithuanian shores. Soviet Lithuania was pretty much a cultural backwater. This is the Lithuanian narrative. Um, the Lithuanian KGB, that's the secret police heir to the NKVD, kept pretty firm tabs on the local population. That museum I mentioned earlier is built out of an old KGB prison. You can go down into the basement and see the execution cells. You can go down to the basement and see the cell where they had you standing on a podium in over freezing cold water, and you're going to fall asleep after 24, 48 hours. You're going to fall into the icy cold water. This is to make you talk. There were protests in Lithuania, but the Baltic countries, for the most part, I mean, were relatively quiescent. They're small. These are small countries. How do you stand up to the mighty Soviet Union, right? There was, for Lithuanians anyway, a famous young man named Romas Kalanta who when he was 19 years old in 1972 burned himself on the streets of Kaunas. Kind of like, we've all heard of the stories in Vietnam of the Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire. He said it was in protest against Soviet rule. And then Lithuanians did find their outlet against the Soviets. They found it in an unlikely place. Yes, basketball. Uh, there is a museum of Lithuanian basketball in Kaunas. And whenever a local team, especially the Kaunas team, played a Moscow team, especially the Red Army team, it became this national event. It's us against them being Goliath, right? The Soviet Red Army basketball team to them was kind of like what the Soviet hockey team was to us in 1980 in Lake Placid. It was Goliath. And there were times when David beat Goliath. And of course, this has now entered the legends and lore among Lithuanian basketball fans. Fast forward to 1992, Lithuania has been independent, barely 2 years. They have no money to send a basketball team to the Olympics. So the Grateful Dead, yes, the Grateful Dead, give them money for air tickets, hotel for accommodations at the Olympic Village, and Grateful Dead T-shirts to wear on the basketball court, and they end up winning the bronze medal against the Dream Team, if you remember back then. Okay, independence comes again. Of all the Soviet republics, at least during this particular time period, late 1980s, Lithuania was one of the most agitating for their freedom again. The then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev vacillated. On the one hand, he eased some restrictions, but then when the Lithuanians declared their independence, this was kind of unexpected for a lot of people. He quickly imposed restrictions on them. And there was a famous standoff that killed several Lithuanians at a TV tower outside Vilnius. On 23rd August 1989, important date, it's the 50th anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. A human chain was created between Vilnius in Lithuania and Tallinn in Estonia. That's about 650 kilometers from one end to the other. And people formed a human chain from one end to the other in a silent protest against the circumstances of their incorporation into the USSR. 11 March 1990, the Lithuanian parliament declared their independence. Iceland was the first to recognize it. Who would have thunk? The USSR never recognized it. And remember, they're the ones with the tanks. They're the ones with the soldiers that are still occupying each of these republics. Okay, so today we have a successful European democracy that has prospered. I'm not saying life has been easy, especially in the 1990s. I had some Lithuanians tell me that 1990s were a rough time, and I said, like Russia? And one of them smiled and said, not that bad. But the living standards rose. They joined NATO in March 2004. They joined the European Union in May 2004. They adopted the euro in 2015. I remember as an intel officer at DIA, we would do these annual tours to Brussels. It was to do a collective NATO intelligence assessment of the world. And it was interesting for me to be there because I was a Middle East expert. So, what is NATO doing assessing the Middle East? Well, the short answer is we were 2 years into our Iraq occupation. And I remember the most outspoken person in the horseshoe-shaped table was the Lithuanian. He was getting occasional backup from the poll, but they were pretty adamant about the nature of the Russian threat. This is 2005, mind you. This is only 5 years into Putin's presidency. He had not yet become the man he would become, but you could already see the Lithuanian fear, right, of the other. The other, in this case, is Russia. Renewed trouble to the east and south. I mean, Belarus the big ex-Soviet republic to the east, languished under a dictator named Lukashenko. Uh, in Russia, Putin was just starting to flex his muscles, although not yet quite. So let's talk about Russia and their perspective on all this business. For their perspective, having the three Baltic countries, all three former Soviet republics, join NATO was strike one, right? We may not agree with their perspective, but this is it. The possible NATO invites to Georgia and Ukraine, made in Bucharest in Romania, was strike two. From this Russian perspective, it's like a slow encirclement, right, by NATO of Russia. Um, so Putin began pressuring the Baltic countries, and he's done so in a variety of ways: frequent airspace violations, cyber attacks. There was a famous attack on Estonia in 2008. Covert sabotage missions. Last year, a Russian military intelligence asset exploded a bomb outside an IKEA. Yes, IKEA, the furniture giant in Vilnius. Um, Large military exercises with Belarus, which is Russia's ally. NATO's concerns have increased. So a Baltic Air Police was formed, rotating fighter aircraft from a number of NATO countries routinely go to one of the three Baltic countries to help protect their airspace from incursions. And then more recently, and from an historical point of view, absolutely stunning, was the deployment of a German armored brigade to Lithuania. These are German tanks. Yes, this is not 1941. This is 2025, rolling down the streets of Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, to help protect Lithuania from a possible attack. So let's look quickly at the geopolitics of Lithuania. Um, a 422-mile border with Belarus. Um, Belarus is a Russian ally. Belarus conducts hybrid operations against Lithuania. So most recently, they began flying over weather balloons by their hundreds over Lithuania, and it forced the shutdown of Vilnius International Airport for a while. There were just so many balloons in the sky; they were an aviation hazard. This is Belarus's way of quietly reminding the Lithuanians, "Hey, we're here. You can't forget us." you know, and look on the map. Um, this is something that I didn't appreciate until I actually got there. Vilnius is only 30 minutes from the border with Belarus. It's parked right up next to the border. In fact, some Belarus politicians claim that Vilnius is a Belarusian city and should belong to them. Uh, Never think these things ever go away. So 30 minutes from the border is nothing. This is a major vulnerability for Lithuania in the event of a crisis. And in fact, there have been emergency evacuation plans to evacuate at least part of the Lithuanian government to Kaunas in the event of stepped up hostilities with Belarus and or Russia. Then you have a border with Russia, which you see there on the southeast. Sorry, the southwest. This is with Kaliningrad. It's an exclave, which is a geographic term for a piece of land that is physically separate from the main piece. Um, it's a result of World War II when the Soviet Union annexed East Prussia, former German territory, and incorporated it into the Russian Soviet Federated Republic. Kaliningrad used to be Königsberg. Um, and over the years, last 20 years, there's been a big military buildup in Kaliningrad. It's easy to see why. It's wedged right in between Poland, one NATO country, Lithuania, another. Um, and then you have the famous Suwałki Gap, 65 miles. That's it. That's Lithuania's border with Poland. It's what physically separates Belarus, one Russian ally, from Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave. You can see how strategic the gap is. So defending Lithuania is a bit of a problem. Um, every 4 years, the Russians and Belarusians conduct this big exercise. They've been doing this since Soviet times, by the way. It's called Zapad. Uh, the word is west. There's nothing original in Russian exercise names. They've got Vostok, east, and they got Zapad, and they got Sredny, the central one. Anyway, and we just got through a Zapad exercise last summer. Big buildup of troops, concentrations near the border with Poland and Lithuania. NATO gets kind of nervous because everybody knows a military exercise may not be an exercise. It could one day be a prelude to an invasion. The troops are there, the equipment's there. What if they cross the line into Suwałki Gap, for example? And by cutting off the Baltics from NATO could create a major problem for NATO to defend Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and Sweden, for that matter. Um, and by the way, Lithuania is flat and forested. There's not a lot of places where you can make a determined stand defensively. And then I mentioned Vilnius and its vulnerability. All right, I'm almost done. Lithuania and the Ukraine war. There are historical linkages between Lithuania and Ukraine that both sides have been quick to trumpet in recent years. You have to go back to that Commonwealth period of 300-400 years ago, um, when parts of what is now Ukraine and Belarus were part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then would be incorporated into Poland and become part of that Commonwealth. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Lithuania was one of the early NATO countries to rally behind Ukraine. And for years, in NATO councils and in EU councils, Vilnius has been trying to push a greater consensus on aiding Ukraine. And I found it fascinating while I was there to see that every single Lithuanian government office flew the Ukraine flag. You knew that it used to be the European Union flag there, but under a government order, they took that one down, and in solidarity, they fly the Ukraine flag. There are all kinds of ads for supporting Ukrainian soldiers. I'll show you one in a minute. There are Lithuanian volunteers for a controversial volunteer unit in Ukraine called the Azov Brigade. Um, Ukraine, from the Lithuanian perspective, is ground zero, right? You can see from their perspective, if Ukraine were lost, in other words, Zelensky overthrown, a more pro-Russian government takes over, they could be next. And if they're not next, then it'll be Estonia or Latvia, right? Or all three together. So walking around the streets of Vilnius, this is right in front of the Lithuanian National Cathedral. The Soviets converted it into a museum of art, but it's been restored. There's an ad here. Thanks to Google Translate, I can translate this as vitally important sales. 200 euros will buy a helmet for a Ukrainian soldier. Um, Here you see the Lithuanians trying to raise money from their own population to help the Ukrainians. This was outside the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry. That's a map of Ukraine in its entirety, including Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine that are now under Russian occupation. Or my favorite, this was on a major building in New Vilnius. Putin, The Hague is waiting for you. This is, of course, a reference to the court that is waiting to try Putin for war crimes in Ukraine. And it's in English. You know, I think it's kind of funny in a way because it's like, all right, this country's Lithuania, but you're advertising this very clearly in English, the de facto lingua franca of Europe. Point made, right? This was in a Kaunas restaurant. Thanks to Google Translate, I was able to translate the Ukrainian, which I don't speak a lick of. Thank you from the BO Charity Fund expresses gratitude to presumably the restaurant owner for, quote, the work of helping the Ukrainian military and making a significant contribution toward the final victory. And it's the Azov 12th Special Forces Brigade and a couple of bullet casings there in case you missed it. This wasn't unusual. I saw a couple of these signs around, but it kind of shows you, even as a tourist who doesn't speak a lick of Lithuanian or Ukrainian, you can get the symbology and realize there's quite a lot of sympathy here. So conclusions. Putin's got dreams of restoring the Soviet Empire, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of Lithuanians have zero interest in a new USSR. Not that Putin is asking them, right? He doesn't care. This is not a world for small countries that we're living in right now. History in Lithuania marks what I would call a near universal mistrust of Russia. Its occupations, all right, some of them prolonged, the Russian Empire, the Soviet occupation, the repression that followed, the mass deportations. This is something that a lot of Ukrainians can't forget, nor is the government letting them, because there are a lot of museums and exhibits to deportations. The Nazi Holocaust is, for me, disturbingly somewhat muted. I mean the memorials of it. There's not much there, and I think this is one of these problems that if you've ever traveled in Eastern Europe, you know what I'm talking about. There's only room enough for one victim. Russian immigration that followed after the incorporation into the Soviet Union. This dramatically reshaped Latvia and even Estonia, Lithuania to a lesser extent. But as modern European countries, what do you do with a large immigrant population who speaks another language? This is a problem in almost every single European country, not necessarily Russians, but immigrants from other countries. What do you do? How do you incorporate them? How do you welcome them, or do you welcome them? There's a lot of anger and animosity here and mistrust, which makes it harder in some cases for these countries to accept people who have been living and even born here but speak another language. There's been, as I mentioned in this brief, armed and passive resistance to that occupation. But I would say this, in closing, whatever your personal views on Russia, the ruthlessness of their army and its brutality has cost Russia a lot of friends in Europe and a lot of mistrust among almost all its neighbors. I don't know whether you want to blame this exclusively on Putin, but there's a problem here. And wishing it away, like some of our politicians want to do, will not make it go away. And these countries certainly know this better than anyone. So let me make just one small plea for small nations. These are small countries with small country complexes. I mentioned a little bit in passing some of their common history. It's not a very cheerful history. There is an existential fear in all three countries of being wiped out. Lithuania is pretty bad. Estonia is the worst because they're the smallest. And so here, this fear that maybe the Russians will invade one day, occupy us, deport all of us. There's only a couple of million and some of Estonians now, and then we'll be wiped out. And that's not hyperbolic, right? Especially in this unfortunate century where our language becomes extinct after one or two generations. Think Native Americans if you want, where our culture and traditions become extinct, where our history is now completely forgotten, erased, right? I mean, I think we can intuitively understand, living here in Montana with an Indian reservation just to the north of us, how some of these complexes are born. This is why they fear Russia today. This is why they're firmly vested in Europe and NATO, because these provide shields and protection where they can be accepted for their identity and their language. Lithuanian is an official language of Europe, according to the European Union. And this is why they fully back Ukraine. And that's not going to change. unless Ukraine's government changes. And so, if you want to find the most fervent supporters of Zelensky and his government, look no further than the three Baltic countries and Poland. So, any questions? By the way, that is Tony Soprano at the Vilnius train station. I have no idea how or why he's there, but it was quite interesting on a cold winter's day to see him there.
Is that like him live?
It's a giant statue of him, I
Oh,
guess
oh, okay.
where he's walking down his driveway to pick up his newspaper, if I'm remembering the scene.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's really excellent. Well, thank you so much for
Mhm.
this really interesting and engaging um, talk. As a reminder, please post your questions in the Q&A. Um, I have a question to start us off. So you mentioned this, substantial demographic difference in Lithuania compared to the other Baltic countries, and that there's a comparatively smaller Russian population. I'm wondering how that interacts with Russian disinformation campaigns. Do you see greater social cohesion among Lithuanians in the face of those disinformation campaigns, or does Russia have to use some other vector of influence?
It's a great question. And with each of the republics, it's different. Lithuania is relatively cohesive because such a large majority are native Lithuanian speakers. I'm not saying that everything's great and hunky dory, but it's better. Estonia is the one that's the smallest and with a substantial Russian population. It's not a plurality and it's not a majority, but it's a large Russian speaking population. Now, up until recently, Estonia has made great efforts, I would say, to provide a good, prosperity relative to Russia for its Russian-speaking people, and so that's kind of an incentive. And remember, all three of these republics are in the European Union, which means that even if you're a Russian speaker in Estonia, you're an Estonian citizen. You can work in England, well, up until recently, the United Kingdom. You can work in France or Germany or Italy. Um, Latvia is a little bit different. They took a harder line on language laws. And these are not easy languages for anyone to learn. And for a lot of Russians who retired in Riga, that's the Latvian capital, there was never the notion when they retired to Riga, a lot of them were from the Soviet armed forces, that they would ever have to learn Latvian, right? And suddenly there's a whole new political situation. From their perspective, as a 70-year-old, they're being made to learn Latvian in order to get Latvian citizenship. That was going to create some resentment and hostility. And that in turn was going to aggravate Latvians who think it's their right to do that. All three of these republics have struggled, I would say, to incorporate their Russian-speaking population. But I mean, it's been harder for Latvia and Estonia because the percentages of Russian speakers is higher. But all that being said, after the invasion of Ukraine began, there was not a large demonstration in favor of Putin's war among Russian speakers in either Estonia or Latvia. And so I think if you are, living in those countries and are a Russian speaker, you're saying, yeah, things may not be great here in terms of respect for my language and my culture, but on the other hand, uh, living standards are higher than they are across the border in Russia, and that might make the difference.
Great. So we have a couple of questions from the chat.
Mhm.
Um, First, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the Russian dissidents present in Vilnius.
There are dissidents. The dissidents, I'm assuming you mean not to the Lithuanian government, but to Putin. Um, there is a dissident group, anti-Putin group in Lithuania, with protection, if you will, or safe haven from the Lithuanian government. It does create obvious tensions in Lithuanian Russian ties. But I think right now Russia's more focused on the problem they're encountering and trying to gain ground in Ukraine. Lithuania is an irritant at this moment. Now, I'm not saying that over the long term Russia doesn't have plans for Lithuania and the other two. Maybe they do. I don't know. I can't read Vladimir Putin's mind. But I think from the perspective of these countries, an easy win in Ukraine, although that seems impossible now, we're 4 years into that war, will mean that they're next. And they're a lot weaker than Ukraine. I mean, militarily, population wise, in terms of land area, they're much, much smaller. So they're much, much more vulnerable. The only thing they have shielding them is NATO. And we have a U.S. administration that right now is kind of dismissive of NATO. So that makes each of these countries far more nervous than they were.
Um, so we have another question from the chat. It kind of switches gears. Is Lithuania doing anything to mitigate the low birth rate? Are they encouraging immigration, for instance?
Immigration is a sensitive subject in a lot of East European countries. And of course, it's becoming even more so in a lot of West European countries because immigration is code for racism. I'll be blunt about this. We're talking about small countries and small numbers of people who are having a hard enough time, from their perspective, incorporating Russian and Polish speakers, let alone trying to encourage immigration from, say, Turkey or Iran or Afghanistan. So I'll say this. I mean, just as a tourist traveling around Vilnius and Kaunas, I did not see a lot of non-white people. I just didn't. And I know from the politics of some of these countries, I'm not just talking Hungary, but also Poland at one time. I mean, I think Poland still, there's a big resistance to taking in immigrants from the Middle East, for example. Here you're cutting into nationalist identities, also well honed religious identities that make it much harder for governments to consider an immigrant solution, if you will, to their population problem. So what do they have? Try and offer incentives to women to have more children. Some countries have a little more resources to do this, like Estonia does. It's wealthier than Latvia and Lithuania. I'm not aware of anything going on in Lithuania, but that's just because I haven't really researched the issue of where they provided incentives to have more children. This is a problem affecting virtually all of Europe now, and also Russia, by the way. And everybody's got their own ideas on how to solve it, but there doesn't seem to be one solution that fixes everything. Um, so that's kind of a long way of answering your question.
That's great. Um, we have another question in the chat. I'm just going to read this one
Mhm.
verbatim. After reading Storm in the Land of the Rain by Sylvia Foti, I understand that there were a significant number of Lithuanians who were part of the extermination of the Jews. Do you have a perspective on this?
Yes, I do. And it won't be popular for Lithuanians. Again, my guidebook, I used the Lonely Planet guide to the Baltic countries. And I was struck by the fact that in the guidebook it said one no-go area in discussions with inhabitants of any of these countries is the Holocaust and their association with it, because they would prefer to imagine that they had no role at all in the Holocaust. And yet, we know from historical sources that Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians were all involved to varying degrees, willing or otherwise, as henchmen in Hitler's Holocaust on the Jews. I'll say this, and not to try and sound too annoying as an American, but you know, the Holocaust Museum, as I said in Vilnius, is a joke. I was struck right away by it being on a back street. No, I mean to find it, you really had to look, and I was the only one in it. Now, granted, it's February, it's cold, but there were a lot more people in the National Museum than there were in the Holocaust Museum, and it was 4 rooms. It was a cottage with 4 rooms, Now, there are a lot of pictures, and it was well done, talking about how the Holocaust affected Lithuanian Jews. It talked about pre-Holocaust Lithuania, taught me a lot about Vilnius and its role in early 20th century Talmudic conscious movements, as well as the spread and publications in Yiddish, which of course is practically an extinct language now, tragically. And then it goes through each of the phases of the Holocaust, and then at the very end. And almost equally tragic was the fact that Vilnius's Grand Synagogue didn't quite survive the war. It was largely in ruins, but when the Soviets came in, rather than reconstruct it, they just bulldozed it and put an apartment building on top of it. So there was no attempt, even by the Soviets as liberators, to try and have any historical consciousness that there was ever a Jewish presence there, even though everybody knows, who should know, that Vilna was once a major Jewish cosmopolitan center. And I think that's sad. I'll just say that. The museum that is there was funded by the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., but it could do with a lot more government help, in my humble opinion.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Um, I think we have time for one more. And so there's another question in the chat that I'm just going to read verbatim. Has Trump's rejection of NATO been beneficial to Lithuania through stronger militaries in large European countries? Or does NATO appear to be threatened by the American ambivalence from Lithuania, from the Lithuanian point of view?
I think there's to answer that question is sort of like look, depending on how you look at it. Overall, the damage to NATO I think is significant. It's rhetorical right now, right? There's no formal U.S. declaration, we're out of NATO. There's just a lot of questioning. If you read the White House's most recent national security strategy statement and how it describes the European Union as essentially almost an enemy of Western civilization. I mean, to me, it's just striking on so many levels of how far we've come in the space of one election. Um, on the flip side of it, this is playing a little bit of devil's advocate. I think you know where I fall on this. It has lit a spark under some European governments to spend more on defense. So, for example, in Germany, long a laggard in spending on its defense. There's been a substantial increase. That deployment of that German brigade to Lithuania probably would not have happened as fast as it did were it not for Trump's election. Because I think the Germans, if not the Spaniards, they're in a shouting match right now, see the writing on the wall. We need to spend more for our defense or we might be next. And so, from the Lithuanian perspective, it means that there's more of a commitment on the part of Germans, at least at the government level, to defending them, which they see as reassurance. But it doesn't quite replace the U.S. deterrent, right? The U.S. backing them and saying we support you in your confrontation with Russia or Belarus, because they're just that isn't coming from this White House, and so the nerves are jangled in Lithuania and Poland, for that matter. There's a fascinating article in this week's Economist about how Poles, who are probably the most pro-U.S. country in Europe, are now much more ambivalent about the United States since our election. They're nervous. They're spending 5% of their gross domestic product, Poland, on defense. Lithuania is spending more than 3%, which is a lot for a country that is only 30 years out of communism and is still trying to develop its economy. These are big commitments on their part. So you could say, from a U.S. standpoint, well, good on them. They needed to spend more on their defense. On the other hand, by even creating the slightest ambiguity that we might be there for them if they're attacked by the Russians or the Belarusians, I think there's, a lot more fear there now where there didn't used to be.
All right. I think we are at time now. So I want to thank you, Professor Sirs, for
Thanks.
such an excellent talk and a timely conversation. And also I want to thank our audience for joining us and caring about these issues. Um, Please join us next week for a first take at noon on March 11th on Iran, and again on April 7th for our Chinatown Hall. Our next Mansfield Dialogue is on April 23rd when we host Professor Kristen DeCasey discussing the 1-year anniversary of Tariff Liberation Day. So thank you again for joining us. Have an excellent rest of your day.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.